So when we look at substance use disorder, the thing we need to remember first and foremost is that it is a chronic medical condition. It is a disease. It is not a choice. It is not a moral failure. It's not a sign of weakness. It is not undifferent than depression or anxiety. It's a condition that can be treated and can successfully be treated. We do realize that there are environmental concerns that play into this, especially seen over the last 2 years. So things like financial issues, food insecurity, housing insecurity, all play into it. And when those added stressors play onto someone who has a genetic profile that predisposes them for addiction, things can really get out of control. Now, we do see that chronic opioid use, people worry, well, if I have somebody who's taking chronic opioids, are they going to be at a higher risk of developing an addiction to opioids? And the answer to that is unlikely. Can it happen? Yes. It only happens in about 8 to 10, 12% of people will develop it. Now, that doesn't seem like much, but 8 to 12% of people who take an opioid, and when we look at how many people take chronic opioids in the U.S., it's a lot of people. The U.S. has a small percentage of the world's population, yet uses approximately 97% of the world's supply of opioid pain medications. So that's a fair amount of people, and we know that when we especially look back at the late 90s and early 2000s when the opioid crisis started, overprescribing was not the cause, but it was one of the leading causes that led to it. When we look at the flip side, though, when we look at people who have an opioid use disorder, heroin was the big one for a long time, fentanyl's the one now. We see that about 4 out of 5 people who have a heroin or other type of opioid use disorder started down that path with a prescription opioid. So it's something that we do need to be aware of. It is an unfortunate problem that does happen with these medications. What we worry about with the medications is that we don't want to disenfranchise individuals who need to be on these medications for purposes of managing their pain. And we're going to talk about that a little bit at the end. Now, when it comes to the actual disease state model of addiction, we realize in the brain that there are 3 primary areas that are affected. There's the basal ganglia, the extended amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. Now, the basal ganglia is where it all kind of tends to start. The basal ganglia contains the ventral tegmental area, which is responsible for the manufacturing of dopamine, which is the happy hormone. It makes you feel pleasure and reward and satisfaction. If you're a Purdue fan, you didn't have any of that last night. But if you're an underdog fan, woohoo, a 15 seed making it to the 8, wow, that was crazy. Dopamine from the ventral tegmental area will then activate the nucleus accumbens and the dorsal striatum. Those are 2 primary or primitive areas of the brain. The nucleus accumbens is responsible for motivation and for reward, and the dorsal striatum is responsible for habits and behavior. It was without these areas of the brain as a species, we never would have made it. This is the part of the brain that controls when we do something good, it tells us, hey, this was a good thing, and then that positive feeling gets reinforced. That's what helps us survive. That's what helped us learn to work as a team. That's what helped us learn how to harness fire. That's what learned to help us build cities. It's because of this section of the brain. Now, what happens in addiction is that the drug, be it opioid, alcohol, or a behavior like gambling, will hijack that area of the brain, and it completely overruns the system with tremendous amount of dopamine. You know, my wife and I are big Disney people. You know, I always tell her, I said, hey, when my student loans are paid off, what do you want to do? Like, do you want to get new floors? Do you want to like get a hot tub? She's like, or we could get Disney Vacation Club membership. So we're going to totally be getting Disney Vacation Club membership. Disney is our thing. We go to Disney all the time. It gives us this dopamine bump. Every time she sees Cinderella's castle, she cries. That's just part of what, that's part of the deal with her. I'm not there yet, but I'm probably going to get there soon enough. But there's such a thing as too much of a good time. We're there for about a week, and then we say, okay, we're ready to go back. With addiction, it's a dopamine surge that's like seeing 10 Cinderella's castles. It's unbelievable amount of dopamine that gets produced. And what we also know is that the brain will associate external stimuli with that type of bump. So if somebody, for example, is shown, who's in recovery or still suffering with their addiction, is shown pictures of drug paraphernalia, we have studies that show that just seeing that will cause a bump in dopamine that's enough for their brain to go, hey, this is good, give me more. We also realize that with chronic use, we have downregulation of the dopamine 2 receptor, and in doing that, that could lead to tolerance, where people feel that they need more and more and more to be able to get the same level of dopamine production at one point they got. A lot of folks who are in recovery tell me there's nothing quite like the first time I used something. People who use for the first time say it was like there was a hole in my heart, and that thing, that drug, that drink, whatever, filled that hole perfectly. It made me feel normal, and it was like I saw the face of God for the first time. That's what people usually say. And they say, I always wanted to try to get back to feel that, not because I wanted a euphoric sensation, but because I wanted to feel normal for the first time. Then we have the extended amygdala. Now, the extended amygdala is where a lot of the notion of craving tends to come from. This is what manages our fight or flight type response. So when we were being chased by the mastodons, this is what helped us stay alive. This also regulates our ability to handle things like anxiety, stress, irritability. When the people who have an addiction are not using their medication, or not using that substance, or engaging in that activity, dynorphin, corticotropin releasing factor are released, and that results in the need for craving. And we know what releases it, and we know what triggers people to use, and it's rather easy. It's stress. Stress is what causes it. And it's not stress necessarily of, is my bracket going to be busted because St. Peter's won again? It's a stress level that is perceived at a level of life and death in this person's brain. That's why individuals tend to relapse at the worst possible times, like right before their custody hearing, or right before that big job interview, or right before the time they have to face their family for the first time in a long time. That level of stress builds up. Am I going to be able to do it? Will they love me, or am I even worthy of love whatsoever? It's ultimately a disease of despair in the fact that if you can't love yourself, why should somebody else love you? And when we see that hopelessness kick in, we know that addiction thrives. And ultimately, this turns into a negative reinforcement loop, where the answer to your brain goes, you know what will get you out of this? The drug. The drug will do it. Not food, not water, not sleep, the drug. The drug is the answer. And then you use the drug, and your brain and your whole body in one collective breath goes, thank you. And then in the next breath says, but you're a piece of garbage. How dare you do that? You should be so ashamed of yourself. And there comes that stress back in and back. I often tell people, as a Disney fan, Star Wars is kind of a thing. So way back in the original, I call it the original, but the episode 1, Jar Jar Binks and all that one, where Yoda says to little Anakin Skywalker, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. That is kind of what happens here. Using leads to shame. Shame leads to anxiety. Anxiety leads to stress. Stress yields craving. That leads using, and now the whole cycle repeats. So we have to try to find a way to break an unhealthy shame cycle when it comes to treating addiction. The last part of the brain that gets impacted is the prefrontal cortex. So this is the most advanced part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that helps us stay apart from the rest of the animal world as a species. This part of the brain is responsible for making good thoughts, rational thoughts. What happens when the brain is shown any type of drug-related issue, or there's a crave that's going on in the midbrain, on functional MRI, when we see this, we'll see the midbrain light up and the prefrontal cortex goes completely dark. So it's people who realize that I don't want to do this, I don't want to potentially get arrested, I don't want to potentially die, I don't want to potentially let down my family, but the brain is just screaming at them, you have to. And I try to tell this to students. I said, how many people have ever felt a notion that's known as being hangry? Ah, yeah, everybody's like, yep, I know what that is. I know that I have a brief window of opportunity to get my wife Taco Bell when she gets hangry. Or no matter what happens, it's my fault. It doesn't matter what it is. And I tell students, how do you feel when you're hangry? And people usually say, I'm very, upset, angry. I'm like, you will push someone down a flight of steps to get something to eat. I said, but then, how do you feel when you get something to eat? Most people say, I feel remorseful. I should have a shirt that says, I'm sorry for what I said, I was hangry. And a lot of people are like, yeah, I get that. And that's what happens here. You know when you're hangry that you're not behaving in a good way, but you almost can't help it. That's what this is like, only infinitely way worse. Because remember, nobody wakes up in the morning and says, you know what I really want to do today? I want to disappoint my family, get arrested, lose my job, potentially go to jail, potentially get an infectious disease, or die. That sounds like a dynamite day. No one's waking up saying that. So I'm not trying to condone the behavior issues seen with people who have an addiction. I'm trying to say that we have to understand where it's coming from. Getting past the behavioral issues is part of the recovery process. That's part of the 12-step program.